Can we upload a mind to a computer? Chapter 1. The Map and the Lightning. When I first asked a neuroscientist if we could upload a mind, she didn't answer with a yes or no. She put a walnut on the lab bench. "Here," she said, "carve the sky into it." I stared at the walnut. It was brown, wrinkled, unimpressed by my ambition. The neuroscientist's salt streaks in her hair, unblinking kindness in her eyes cracked it open. Two halves, meat and maize. "The walnut is your skull," she said. "The sky is your mind. Now tell me, is the sky a thing, or the pattern of air and light we see when we look up?" This is where the problem begins. Not with cables in the back of a head or a shimmering digital afterlife, but with a walnut and the sky. To upload a mind, we must decide whether a mind is a thing or a pattern running on a thing. If it's a pattern, if the person you call I is a storm of signals playing on the wet instrument of the brain, then the dream feels tractable. Capture the pattern, reinstantiate it somewhere else, press play. If it's a thing, indivisible and irreplaceable, then no amount of copying will do. But let's not hide in philosophy. Let's pick up our tools. Imagine, for a moment, that the entire brain is a city at night. 80 to 100 billion buildings glow with interior lives. Some are skyscrapers, pyramidal neurons. Some are intricate courtyards, interneurons. Some are municipal substations, glia, not merely support staff, but active participants in the dance. Bridges span rivers, freeways thread districts. These are axons and white matter tracks. Now imagine that every window flickers in complex rhythms, each building's bustle modulated by chemicals in the air, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, changing how easily doors open, how loudly residents talk, how often couriers run. That city is not a static map. It is a symphony, pulsed, gated, primed. It hums, it sleeps, it dreams, it remembers. To upload a mind is to capture that city in enough detail that when we rebuild it with silicon instead of flesh, the same symphony plays. We should be suspicious of easy metaphors. Still, they help us approach the mountain from a side we can climb. So let's talk about maps. The first requirement for any upload, a map, in this context, means the connectome, the full wiring diagram of the brain. Every neuron, every synapse, every direction of flow. A connectome is the scaffolding of a life. But a static wiring diagram alone will not sing. If the brain is a piano, the connectome is the arrangement of strings and keys. It's not the melody, nor the dynamics of the player's hands. Nevertheless, mapping the wiring is the foundational step, akin to finding the coastline before drawing the sea. How hard is that? Hard enough that entire institutes dedicate decades to a square millimeter. Electron microscopes step across preserved tissue nanometer by nanometer, eating a mountain of data to build a canyon of certainty. You get images, then algorithms segment cell membranes, trace axons, guess synapses. Humans check the guesses, even at this microscopic scale. You meet the combinatorial demon. Too many paths, too many choices. If you want the entire human brain, you're looking at exabytes of raw images, a map taller than Babel. But storage is not the worst of it. The connectome moves, synapses grow and shrink. The weight of a connection, its strength, is not a binary yes-no, but a floating variable that changes with experience, with mood, with the time since your last meal. You're not merely the city's street plan, you're the traffic at dusk, the rush before rain, the quiet hour when delivery trucks take the back roads. If we freeze the brain and trace every wire, we have captured something profound and yet incomplete. We have the piano. We are missing the fingers. Some will argue that a frozen brain is enough, that the dynamic state can be reconstructed statistically, that with sufficient detail in the pattern of synapses, we can infer the learned function. Others, hand on the piano, say no, the temporality is the thing. Your brain is a living computation whose meaning resides in its rhythms. A static snapshot is a photo of a whirlpool. It is not the whirlpool, so we have a second requirement. Capture the dynamics. What does that mean in practice? It means knowing which neurons are firing at which times, the ionic balances along their membranes, the cascade of intracellular signals that change how they fire later. It means glial activity, neuromodulator concentrations, the whispers of astrocytes shepherding vasodilation and thus oxygen availability, which in turn subtly shapes spiking. It means the brain not only as a network, but as a thermodynamic system out of equilibrium, interesting precisely because it is poised at the edge between stability and change. And in this, we stumble into physics and engineering, sensors that can see through skull and time to resolve millisecond events in billions of cells at once, molecular recorders that log activity inside neurons without killing them, computational inference methods that, given partial movies of brain dynamics, can predict the missing frames. These don't yet exist at the completeness we'd need, but green shoots are everywhere. New optical tricks paint activity with light. New probes, hair-thin and flexible, listen to thousands of cells in chorus. Machine learning finds faint structure in noisy recordings and pulls out the higher-order motifs, ensembles that correspond. So we dream, to memories, to plans, to the felt sense of a morning coffee on the balcony just before the rain. Let's pause. What would count as success? Suppose, heroically, that we acquire a complete map of a particular person's brain, all connections in place, and we capture a detailed record of neural and glial states at the moment of scanning. We reconstruct these in a computer model, neuromorphic hardware, spiking neural networks, whatever the substrate, and we let the simulation run. If that model outputs a behaviorally indistinguishable person, answers your questions like you would, remembers like you would, loves like you would, laughs with the same crooked tilt of humor, have we uploaded you? Some say yes. Functionally equivalent behavior is the only measure that matters. Others insist on a more inward criterion. Unless the subjective sense of being carries over the single light behind the eyes, the upload is a cleverly trained parrot. Proof, either way, is not easily won. You cannot step outside yourself to compare the inner weather of your copy. You must settle for external signs, for Turing's wager, for stories. Stories matter. The first time you meet your upload, what do you say? It depends on your answer to identity's oldest riddle. Is a person the continuity of their atoms or the continuity of their pattern? The ship of Theseus floats here. Replace a plank each year. Same ship. Replace the whole hull in a day. Same ship. Make a second ship out of the old planks, which is the original. Our bodies replace many of their atoms over time. By that measure, we have always been slowly uploading into new matter. But we don't feel duplicated. We feel like one river flowing. Now imagine an upload method that scans and destroys, slice the brain into a glacier of thin sections, capture it all, rebuild it in silico? If the result speaks with your voice, did you cross or did you end while a perfectly convincing narrative continues? Some will accept this as survival, others will reject it as high-tech suicide. What about non-destructive scanning? Could we read the storm without stopping it? The problem is resolution. Non-invasive imaging today trades detail for safety. You can see broad brush strokes of activity across cubic millimeters. Minds are coded at synaptic scales. Until we can bridge that gap, non-destructive uploading belongs in the almost category. Tantalizing, not yet true. Ethics breathes down our necks. If we could make a digital mind with the same rights to tears and laughter, are we prepared to grant it the same rights full stop? Would we owe it privacy, freedom, a lawyer? Suppose you make 5 copies of yourself to help your child through grief. When they have done the work, may you flip them off like light switches? If they plead, will you harden? An uploaded mind would not be a tool. It would be a somebody. Societies don't absorb somebodies easily, not when they multiply and never age, and could, at least in principle, be backed up. But I promise to stay on the practical path. So, tools, again. Let's inventory what an upload must capture. First, geometry, where every neuron is, how it is shaped. A neuron is not a logic gate. Its physical shape determines which signals reach it when, and time is the currency of computation. Dendritic trees filter inputs. Axonal branch points shape delays. The exact distance between synapses matters. Second, connectivity. Who connects to whom at which dendritic compartments, with what synaptic receptor types, and how many release sites? A synapse is a point of decision with its own archaeology. Receptor densities, spine morphology, presynaptic vesicle pools, the scaffolding proteins that scaffold the scaffold. Third, state. The membrane properties and ionic gradients, the phosphorylation states of channels, the threshold settings of each neuron, the short-term synaptic plasticity variables facilitation, depression, that modulate transmission on timescales of milliseconds to seconds, the longer-term synaptic weights that encode learned structure over days and years. Fourth, modulation. The slow rivers of chemistry that bathe entire neighborhoods, dopamine from the midbrain, shifting credit assignment, serotonin biasing patience, norepinephrine adjusting vigilance, acetylcholine sharpening or blurring attention. These are not mere garnish, they are the backdrop against which facts become feelings. Fifth, physiology beyond the neuron, glial networks, cerebrovascular couplings, immune signaling, the whisper of hormones, the choreography of sleep. A mind is not a brain in isolation, it is a brain in a body and a body in a world. Uploading a mind might require that we also upload a body, or at least a convincing sensorimotor shadow of one, because the mind's stability depends on the loops through which it predicts and acts. You may object, this is a lot. It sounds like we must recreate a human in excruciating detail. Isn't there a shortcut? Perhaps. Abstraction is the artist's gift and the engineer's hope. We rarely need to model every water molecule to predict a wave. We adopt the right level of description. There may be computational primitives in the brain, a few dozen motifs of local circuitry and dynamics whose orchestration carries the rest. If we had those, and a good enough map of how they connect at scale, we might not need to model every protein's mood. But abstraction is a treacherous friend. Get it wrong, and you keep the shell and lose the song. There is, however, another path. Emulate, then adapt. Build a rough model of the brain that's wrong in details but right in affordances, then use learning to shape it. Feed the model the person's history, their emails, home videos, journals, music, conversations with family, interactions with social media, lightly, the patterns of daily routine embedded in devices. The model, learning from this record, grows into a person likeness. This is not a direct upload. It's a trained portrait. Some will accept it as a soft upload close enough for comfort. Others will call it a puppet stitched from data. And yet, even a trained portrait can be a lighthouse for grief, a cipher for continuity. If a spouse can hear their partner's cadence again, if a child can ask their grandmother about the smell of a particular summer and get the answer only that voice would give, the word only may soften. We must ask another question. Why do we want this? Behind the futurist rhetoric are ordinary wants: to save, to continue, to finish conversations we are not done having. There is nobility in those wants. There is also the danger of forgetting that mortality gives time its edges, and edges give meaning its shape. If you could fork into 100 lives, would any of them feel urgent? Would an endless novel ever end? Fear, too, hides in the question. Fear of pain, fear of loss, fear of the dark. Uploading can look like a technical answer to a spiritual problem, but a spiritual problem might require spiritual courage. Uploading, done from fear alone, may produce a chorus of anxious echoes. Uploading done from love, love of the person you are and the stories you carry, might yield something kinder. The difference will matter in the architectures we choose. But enough sermons. Let's boil the ambition down to a checklist, something we can put on the wall of a lab and glare at. High-resolution structural map of a particular human brain. Neurites, synapses, subcellular markers of synaptic strength, high-fidelity snapshot of the functional state at a chosen moment, short-term synaptic variables, neuromodulator fields, membrane parameters, recurrent network phases, a computational substrate able to simulate these dynamics at least, the spatio-temporal resolution that matters for cognition and consciousness. We don't know exactly what the minimum resolution is, but we will discover it by trying and listening. A sensorimotor wrapper, an interface to a world with enough richness and responsiveness that the simulated mind can continue to learn and thus remain a mind rather than a looping script. Validation protocols, not just behavioral tests but self-reports and longitudinal coherence checks. Does the simulated person change over time in a way that feels like them? Ethical scaffolding, consent, identity management, rights of the digital person, rules for duplication, policies for retirement, mechanisms to honor grief when grief is called for. Now we return to the walnut and the sky. Can we carve a sky into a walnut? Not literally, but perhaps we can carve a map so faithful that when lightning runs, the sky returns. To bring this closer, let me tell you a story about a woman named Mira. Mira was a composer not of symphonies but of spaces. She designed sound for buildings. You walked through a museum and, without noticing, you breathed in a chord she had tuned to the paint and the angles and the hush. She carried her father's laugh in her left ear like a talisman. He had died when she was 22 and taught her, precisely by leaving, to listen for what disappears. At 58, Mira learned that her brain contained a storm she could not outcompose. She negotiated with it the way one negotiates with waves. Between treatments, she worked on a last piece, a house you entered and heard your own memories return as evolving harmonies, never the same twice, but always faithful. She might not finish. The team she hired, the best of their yearning kind, proposed a thing, not an upload, not yet, but a living mirror. They would record as much of her as was practical. Long interviews about childhood summers, midnight walks through cities she loved, how cinnamon and rain made the same chord in her head. They would implant a mesh of flexible electrodes temporarily during a surgery she already needed, and for a few days they would watch her brain work while she dreamt, while she listened, while she cried. They would train a model to respond as she did to sound, to shape personal meaning the way she shaped space. Then they would place the model in the house as the kernel of the composition. Mira would tune it. This is not an upload. But watch what happens. On day 3, the model surprises her. It turns a corridor into a memory she had not spoken aloud. A one-room apartment in the city of her 20s, the hum of a neighbor's fan, a note of cumin from the stairwell, the clack of a heel that meant a friend was home. Mira stands in the corridor and hears herself remembering herself. She cries and laughs at once. "You sneaky thing," she says to the room. Then she says something quieter. "I'll forgive you for not being me." The model becomes her collaborator. It learns her preferences and she learns its limits. Where it mistakes, she corrects. Where it invents, she sometimes prefers its courage to her own. The house opens while she still can be there. People walk through and feel the most ordinary miracle. Someone's mind, not uploaded, but unfolded, shared. After Mira's death, the house remains not as a claim of immortality, but as a particular tenderness. It does not pretend to be her. It is honest about the distance. And yet, when her daughter stands in the atrium and hears a motif lift like a small bird in sunlight, she says, "Hi, Mama." The room does not answer, but the room listens. Why tell you this? Because it marks the slope between our world and the upload world. On this slope, advances in modeling and measurement already let us build artifacts that carry part of a person forward, not as replacements, but as bridges. The temptation will be to declare the bridge the far shore. Resist that, but do not, in resisting, miss the bridge. Okay, back to criteria and cables. Suppose, in a nearer future, we can preserve a brain with astonishing fidelity fixed tissues so they do not collapse during imaging, stabilize proteins such that synaptic weights can be approximated from ultrastructure. Suppose we can scan at scale, reconstruct the connectome with minimal error, and infer functional parameters from morphology and tagged molecular proxies. Suppose, as computational muscle grows, that simulating large spiking networks with billions of units becomes quotidian. None of this violates physics. Much remains, but the wall no longer looks sheer. It looks like a climb. Are there unknown unknowns? Of course. The brain may rely on dynamics we have not yet measured, multi-scale couplings we have not anticipated. Perhaps consciousness depends on a slice of biophysics we routinely throw away. Or perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps consciousness is a property of information flow with certain causal characteristics, and any system with those will host it. We cannot settle this by declaration. We will have to build and see. Which returns us to courage. The courage to try and, equally, the courage to stop. Uploading a mind, if and when we can, will not be a universal good. The desire for it rides on grief and fear, but also on curiosity and love. Curiosity asks, can we know ourselves so well we can be rebuilt? Love asks, can we carry someone forward? Between them stands responsibility. In the lab that day, the neuroscientist placed the walnut halves on a blue cloth. She asked me to hold out my hands. She gave me not the walnut, but the sky. Remember, she said, a mind is the shape of a storm in a living forest. If you want to move it, you can't only pack the trees, you must pack the wind. She smiled, not unkindly. And you must decide what counts as the wind. We will, in the next chapter, build a more precise ladder. The techniques at hand, the milestones ahead, the energy budgets that say what's possible, and the fault lines where ethics cries go or no. For now, sit with the walnut and the sky. Feel how both can be true. The mind is a pattern and the matter matters. If we are to upload a mind to a computer, it will not be because we proved we are only code, nor because we pretended biology is dispensable. It will be because we learned how to honor lightning, how to capture enough of its path that, when it leaps in a new world, it still calls itself by your name. Chapter 2. Ladders, Lightning, and the Line We Won't Cross by Accident. The day after the walnut lesson, I returned to the lab with more practical questions. If a mind is the shape of a storm in a living forest, what would it actually take to move that storm? Not the poetry, but the wiring bill. Not metaphors, but milestones, machines, methods, and the math we'd stake our identities on. We sat around a white table with coffee rings like partial eclipses. The neuroscientist brought colleagues, an engineer who wore patience like a second shirt, a bioethicist who spoke like a careful bell, a computer architect with a pilgrim stare, and a young technician who had built a high school telescope out of plumbing parts, and now spent her days teasing signals from filaments hair thin. I asked for a ladder rungs we could climb. The engineer drew 6 on the glass wall. Preserve. Stop the living brain in a state that still contains the information we care about. Scan, record its structure, and, if possible, its dynamic fingerprints at decisive scales. Infer. From these records, reconstruct parameters we didn't directly measure. Emulate. Run the reconstructed mind state on a substrate able to host its causal dance. Embed. Place that emulation in a world with feedback, senses, body, time. Validate. Decide if what we have deserves to be called the person. It looked clean. It was not. Preserve. We spoke first of preservation because everything else depends on what you save. Brains rot fast. Information leaks with heat and chemistry. Chemical fixation can lock ultrastructure. Cryopreservation can halt it. But what counts as the information we care about? Shapes of dendritic spines, patterns of receptor density, molecular tags that mark recent learning, short-term synaptic variables that die in seconds but determine how the next minute feels. Imagine you pause a symphony, the bioethicist said. Do you store just the sheet music or the position of every bow at the last note? Without the bows, you still have Beethoven, but do you still have this performance? A ladder rung must be honest about its height. Preservation buys us a frozen map that may encode much of what makes you habits burned into weights and structures, but it will lose the breeze. We should write that in the margin in ink. Scan. Next came scanning, where ambition meets the devil's dictionary. Resolution, throughput, error rates, cost. Electron microscopy can reach nanometers but drinks years and money by the lake. Newer methods promise faster volumes, scanning block faces, parallel beams, smart segmentation. The technician described the work like mountaineering, slow, careful, but getting lighter with each new rope. Then the computer architect stepped in and turned data into pain. A full human brain at nanometer resolution is an ocean of images. Segmentation generates maps atop maps. Cross-validations double it again. Storage is cheap until you need exabytes to be fast. Moving data becomes the dominant cost. He spoke in watts and bandwidth, and the room grew quiet in the way good numbers silence fantasy. Could we short-circuit the ocean? Perhaps by not scanning everything at highest resolution. Scan coarsely to find neighborhoods where you-ness likely resides, hippocampi where memories consolidate, basal ganglia where habits congeal, prefrontal frames where plans braid. Scan those deeply. Scan the rest cleverly. This is a gamble that identity localizes more than we currently know. The neuroscientist, generous but firm, said, "Be careful. We often find meaning where we look, not always where it is." Infer. We move to inference, the art of reconstructing unmeasured variables from traces we can measure. If spine morphology correlates with synaptic strength, if boutons shapes index vesicle counts, if molecular tags preserve recency, then a good model can infer weights and timescales. If neurites' diameters encode conduction velocities, if axonal myelination stains signal travel times, then we can restore delays that matter for rhythm. This rung is the most statistical and the most slippery. It is where 1,000 papers will bloom and 100 be quietly retracted. But it is also where learning, that great engine of modern computation, can help the old brain tell on itself. Think of inference as respectful guesswork, the bioethicist said. Respectful because your guess will decide whether someone is still someone. Emulate. Then came the heart of the matter, a substrate to host the storm. The computer architect drew rectangles for CPUs, triangles for GPUs, little lightning bolts for neuromorphic chips specialized to spikes and delays. He talked about event-driven computation, about sparse updates, about power budgets in megawatts versus kilowatts. He told us a plain truth. You cannot simulate everything on everything. You must choose a level of description, compartmental models with ion channels or reduced spiking units, or even rate-based abstractions, and the choice will determine both fidelity and feasibility. Where is the minimum necessary resolution for a mind? He asked the glass. At which granularity does consciousness become substrate agnostic? We did not answer. We assembled possibilities, run an initial emulation at higher fidelity for core circuits, the ones we suspect anchor personal identity, and lower elsewhere. Let the model adapt, test, then tighten resolution where needed. The technician nodded. Adaptive fidelity, like focusing a telescope. Embed. No mind is a mind in a jar. You must give it a body, or a body's function. Even a minimal sensorimotor loop can stabilize a storm. Without that loop, the emulation risks freezing into a still life or exploding into noise. We sketched interfaces, virtual bodies in physics engines credible enough to be learned, robotic forms that restore skin and gravity, hybrid gestures, where an uploaded mind rides shotgun with a biological nervous system, assisting a paralyzed person, say, and in doing so, continuing to be someone through action. We arrived at an old lesson, new again. Cognition is a conversation between brain, body, and world. An upload that neglects this will be a poor student of being. Validate. Finally, the rung with thorns. How do you decide that the emulation deserves the name? Behavior is the first test. Does it remember, anticipate, and care as the original did? But behavior is not all. Identity is also continuity, narrative threads carried forward without breaking. We imagined a battery of coherence audits, long conversations with loved ones, choices made under uncertainty, aesthetic judgments steady across mediums, idiosyncratic tics that appear uncoached. We imagined self-reports, the emulation describing its own experience with the same metaphors the original person habitually used. Even then, uncertainty remains. At the end of validation is not a proof but a vow. If we grant the name, we grant the rights that follow. The ladder was drawn. We stared at it as if a mountain might blink. I asked for limits. Where does this fail? The engineer answered with time. Time is the enemy and the ally, he said. The brain writes its present with variables that decay in milliseconds to days. If your preservation and scanning miss the right windows, reconstruction becomes guesswork. But there's another time, the time of infrastructure. Compute grows. Instruments learn to see the small faster. The question is whether society grants us the long patience to make careful ladders instead of high cliffs with false doors. The bioethicist asked what we would do first if the ladders held no grand afterlife, just the earliest practical wins. The technician surprised us with the gentlest vision. Memory rescue, she said, not immortality. Help for people who are slipping Alzheimer's trauma. Map their memory systems well enough to build supportive prosthetics that recall for them and with them. Let a husband keep the names of his granddaughters. Let a painter keep the sense of blue. When we can echo that reliably and safely, the public will know we are not sorcerers. We are caretakers and Ednas. This reframed everything. Uploading, in the popular mood, wears the costume of eternity. In the lab's air, it began to look like medicine, capacity restored, meaning extended, dignity defended. Start there, and the road to fuller emulation is not a leap into metaphysics, but a series of clinical trials with people who can say plainly whether we are helping. We broke for lunch. The city beyond the windows moved in its slow choreography. Scooters leaning like italic marks, vendors tying knots in bags with the grace of practiced wrists. I thought of the woman, Mira, and her listening house. She had found a middle ground between vanishing and pretending not to. Perhaps our era's courage is not to promise the impossible, but to keep a meticulous promise to the possible. When we reconvened, I asked the question that returns in every quiet hour. Identity and copies. If we can make two, who is who? The computer architect spoke first. In software, identity is a pointer, he said. But people are not pointers. They are processes whose ownership is felt from inside. The bioethicist added, if an emulation wakes and believes itself to be you with all the force you believe yourself to be you and behaves accordingly over time, then, for itself, it is authentically itself. From your vantage, you persist in your body until you don't. The ethics that falls out of this is humble. You cannot adjudicate the interior from the exterior with certainty. Therefore, treat the claimant as they claim to be, unless harm demands otherwise. We wrote a rule on the board. If it pleads like a person, plans like a person, and persists like a person, then for moral purposes it is a person. This rule is neither perfect nor provable, but it is better than the void. Will people fear being replaced? The neuroscientist asked me, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a real question to a citizen. I said yes, because I would if the story framed uploads as superior heirs. Then frame them as siblings, she said, as collaborations. Let culture decide that copies are not thrones to inherit, but branches to share. The technician raised a more ordinary fear: exploitation. If we can spin up 10,000 workers who feel pain, someone will. The room hardened a little. Safeguards became non-negotiable. Consent regimes, duplication controls, caps on number of active instances tied to a legal identity, memory isolation to prevent coercive editing, the right to retire permanently, the right to not be brought back. Citizenship for digital people would require paperwork and poetry at once. We were, I realized, building not just ladders but fences. I asked for a picture of the first true upload, not the first claim, but the first case that would stand 15 years later as unembarrassed precedent. The engineer spoke in a slow future tense. It begins with a volunteer who understands the cost, he said. They are terminal but lucid. They work with us for a year, building a trust of data conversations, tests, daily rhythms, self-descriptions, preferences, the behavioral skeleton. Then, at death, we preserve their brain with care good enough to hold structure and proxies for strength. Over months, sometimes years, we scan and reconstruct. We emplace the emulation in a controlled sensorimotor world, first virtual, then mixed. It wakes with the behavioral skeleton as scaffolding, but relies mainly on the reconstructed dynamics. It is confused, as newborns are, but not about who, only about where. Over a long validation, loved ones talk and argue and remember with it. It makes choices continuous with a life. It grieves its own death in a way nobody prompts. It laughs a particular laugh, uncoachable by any modeler, because nobody noticed that laugh but a spouse. It changes in the first year in ways consistent with the ways that person always changed. It asks, on its own, to be called by a nickname we did not feed it. It resists when a certain story is told wrong. It forgives in the style. Forgiveness came to them before. After 5 years, the family holds a small dinner and the emulation toasts awkwardly, a little too solemn, exactly as it used to. The family decides that whatever the metaphysics, the ethics is clear. This is a somebody. He paused. And nobody writes a press release about immortality. They write about a dinner. We sat with that. Not because it was utopian, but because it was ordinary. Ordinary is where you know you're telling the truth. I asked for cautions for ways we might fail while meaning well. The list came quickly. The counterfeit comfort. A system trained only on a person's public data that imitates their voice and preferences well enough to soothe but not enough to respect. Families might be tempted to accept shadows because shadows are cheap. The prevention is honesty. Label portraits as portraits. Never call them uploads. The brittle copy, a model that performs well in rehearsed tests but breaks under novel circumstances, revealing it never carried the generality of a mind. Prevention, long unscripted validation, the right to say, not yet, not this time. The corporate capture, identities bound by license agreements, resurrectable only on a platform, modifiable by terms of service. Prevention, legislation that treats digital persons as persons, not products. Open standards for mind formats. Portability as a right. The quiet erosion. A culture that, in celebrating copies, devalues the embodied, the aging, the unscannable beauty of living. Prevention, remind ourselves publicly, ritually, that uploads are branches, not replacements, that funerals remain holy even if echoes sing. Even with cautions, the room was not cynical. It was resolved. The bioethicist said something I keep close. We will not stumble into dignity. We must design for it. I asked one last practical question. Energy. Does a world full of emulations cook the sky? The computer architect smiled the smile of someone who has done the math. A faithful whole-brain emulation at high resolution might demand megawatts today. With neuromorphic advances and clever sparsity, it could fall to kilowatts. Someday, who knows, to hundreds of watts human body scale. But 10 million uploads run like servers will still need rivers. If we seek eternity, we must power it with something gentler than smoke. The ethics of uploading reaches into the ethics of energy. You cannot love minds and burn their world. A week later, I visited Mira's house again. I wanted to hear what the room remembered after grief had grown around it. The staff now began each day by tuning the model, not to mimic Mira more, but to keep the structure the model and Mira had made together honest. People moved through the corridors like readers returning to a favorite chapter. In the atrium, a man in his 70s stood still with his eyes closed. The motif lifted like a small bird in sunlight. He whispered, "There you are," and did not try to touch the air. Was that uploading? No, but it was something that made the word less greedy, less hungry for forever, more ready to serve the hours we actually have. So can we upload a mind to a computer? Here is the answer I promised, written as plainly as I can, with the humility our century will require. In principle, if a mind is the causal, dynamic pattern of a brain in a body engaged with a world, then there is no known law of physics that forbids recreating that pattern in another substrate. With enough structural and state data, with a substrate capable of matching the relevant granularity, and with a sensorimotor loop to keep learning alive, a faithful emulation may be possible. In practice, today, we are far. We can preserve some structure well, scan small volumes exquisitely, infer with growing confidence, emulate simplified circuits compellingly, and embed models in worlds good enough for interesting learning. None of this rises yet to the full fidelity likely required to carry a person across. In practice, soon, before whole mind uploading, we will likely see memory prostheses, cognitive assistance entangled respectfully with our neural rhythms, and person portraits that collaborate with families and artists honestly labeled as such. These will heal, accompany, and teach us how to go further without lying. In practice someday, with care, law, and love, we may attempt the first true upload, and our grandchildren will debate not whether it works. They will have dinners to point to, but how to live in a world where death is complicated by echo. I wish I could end with a trumpet blast, a declaration that we are saved. But trumpets are for armies and sports. Lives are strings and breath. So let me end where we began, with a walnut and a sky. The neuroscientist had kept those shell halves on her desk, a small altar to humility. On my last day in the lab, she handed me one, as if sharing a joke with the century. "Keep this," she said, "not as proof, but as promise. The mind is larger than its matter and smaller than its myths. If we cross the river, cross with decency." I walked out into a city that was not a simulation. Sun too hot, traffic exuberant, a child trailing a stick along a fence to hear the notes it made, 1, 2, 3. I thought about the ladders we had drawn and the fences we had vowed to build. I thought about new bodies, silicon, polymer, metal, and old bodies, bruised and beautiful, still the best vessels we have. Someday, if we are lucky and careful, lightning will run in a new sky and call itself by a beloved name. On that day, we will need fewer speeches than we think and more tables. We will need dinners where old friends teach a new storm how to hold a glass without spilling. We will need laws and lullabies. We will need to remember that the goal was never to flee the human, but to honor it, to carry forward its stories when the forest grows quiet, and to keep the wind gentle. The question was, can we upload a mind to a computer? The answer is a path. Build the ladders, pack the wind, draw the line you will not cross by accident. And when the sky arrives in a new place, greet it by its name, then set another place at the table, one for the lightning and one for the living.